Hey guys, tonight we begin in a place that doesn't look dangerous at all. A tailor's workshop in the heart of Victorian London. Picture it, the flicker of gaslight against cracked plaster walls, the sharp snip of scissors slicing through cloth, chalk dust hanging in the air like a ghost that never leaves. It sounds refined, doesn't it? Suits, waistcoats, the elegance of the age. But behind every polished gentleman strutting in a crisp new coat was a tailor slowly being smothered by wool fibers, poisoned by dyes, and bent double over a workbench until his spine gave out. The job may have dressed society in its Sunday best, but it killed the people who stitched the seams. I'm your tipsy historian, so pour yourself something for the ride. Gin if you're feeling Victorian about it, brandy if you're fancy, or just a strong cup of tea if that's what's keeping you awake tonight. Whatever's in your glass, raise it, because we're about to step into the tailor shop together. Before we get too far, let me ask you something. If you end up enjoying this little trip into the dim, dusty corners of history, go ahead and like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy it. I'd rather have a small circle of real drinking companions than a room full of people pretending to sip along. And tell me in the comments, where are you tuning in from? And what time is it for you right now? Somebody's probably watching this at sunrise in Tokyo, while someone else is fighting sleep at 3 a.m. in Chicago. And I love knowing we're all scattered across time zones, but gathered here at the same table. So, dim the lights, lean back, and ease into the story with me. Tonight we'll trade the glamour of fine suits for the grit, the poison, and the pain hidden in the tailor's trade. This is the deadly job of the Victorian tailor. Step into a Victorian tailor's shop and you won't find elegance, you'll find a cave. The air is thick with candle smoke and gas fumes, the windows sealed tight to keep out drafts that might disturb delicate fabrics. Imagine working inside a kettle with scissors. Every breath tastes of singed wick and chalk dust. Every corner is stacked with cloth bales that seem to lean closer as the night drags on. Ventilation? Forget it. The only air movement is when someone sighs too heavily or slams down an iron. The hours were brutal, 14, sometimes 16 in a single day. Bodies bent like question marks over benches, shoulders rounded, eyes straining in half light. Fingers jabbed by needles again and again, little spots of blood hidden in seams no gentleman would ever notice. There's something poetic about that. Tiny drops of tailor's blood stitched into the lapels of London's elite, invisible souvenirs of someone else's suffering. And who kept this machine running? Boys. Apprentices as young as 12, yanked from school and dropped into workshops where the rules were simple. Sew, suffer, and don't complain. They worked until their hands cramped, then worked some more. Many didn't even go home at night. They rolled out threadbare blankets under the very benches they spent the day slaving over. A child's lullaby in the 1850s might have been the sound of shears clacking above their head while masters argued over deadlines. Childhood traded for waistcoats and trousers. It's hard not to laugh bitterly at the contrast. We think of tailors as artisans, men with measuring tapes and pincushions shaping the future of fashion. But in reality, they were bent shadows coughing in gaslight, with kids passed out on the floor beside them. This wasn't the glamour of Savile Row. This was survival stitched one aching hem at a time. And here's where I can't help but guilt trip you a little. Imagine a boy sewing his fingertips raw for 16 hours straight, blood in his seams, hunger in his stomach, and you can't even press subscribe? Really? If that's you, then at least confess in the comments why you treat me worse than a Victorian apprentice. We'll all take turns rolling our eyes at your excuse. Now pour another sip, because the workshop only gets darker once we start talking about the very tools tailors used. Tools that drew as much blood as they did stitches. Now, let's talk about the tools of the trade. The very objects that turned cloth into coats and men into corpses. A tailor's scissors weren't the little desk pair you keep around to open Amazon packages. These were monsters. Heavy iron shears, sharp enough to shave a button clean off, but heavy enough to warp a wrist after hours of use. Day after day, tailors snipped and sliced until their hands trembled, joints stiffened, and their tendons screamed. Repetitive strain injuries weren't a diagnosis back then. They were just called getting old at 35. And every so often, those giant blades slipped. Picture your thumb in the wrong place, and suddenly the only thing you're stitching is your own flesh. Then there were the needles and pins. Harmless, right? Wrong. Tiny punctures became breeding grounds for infection. And infection in the 19th century wasn't a neat little course of antibiotics. A pinprick today might mean a Band-Aid. Back then, it could mean your finger swelled, turned black, and left you in a feverish sweat, hoping you'd keep the hand that fed you. Imagine bleeding into every pair of trousers you sew and praying the man who wears them never realizes he's sporting part of your immune system. Ironing was its own battlefield. Tailors used irons heated with glowing coals, heavy bricks of metal filled with live fire. Leave one too long on the cloth and the garment smoked. Hold one too close to your hand and you smoked. Workshops caught fire often because, let's face it, the safety manual back then was just, don't drop the iron into the pile of fabric. OSHA didn't exist. Their version of workplace safety was praying the coal iron didn't explode in your lap. And by the later part of the century, sewing machines started appearing. A miracle of productivity and a curse for fingers everywhere. Those early machines were unforgiving. Misplace your hand for a second, and the needle came down like a guillotine. Mangled nails, torn tendons, shattered joints. Plenty of tailors left the workshop with one less working finger than they came in with. Progress always has a body count, and in Victorian tailoring, it was usually measured in digits. If you've made it this far, think about it. Men and women risked sliced thumbs, infected fingers, burnt hands, and machine-mangled wrists just so someone could look fashionable at Sunday service. And if you're still watching without subscribing, that's like walking out of a tailor's shop in a brand new suit and refusing to pay. Go ahead, leave your excuse in the comments. We'll measure it, cut it down to size, and laugh at how poorly it fits. But we haven't even gotten to the invisible killers yet. The poisons hidden in the very fabric. The colors so vibrant they could light up a ballroom and quietly kill the man who stitched them. Now, if the scissors didn't cut you and the irons didn't roast you, the fabric itself would happily finish the job. Victorian fashion loved bold colors, emerald greens, deep blues, inky blacks, shades so rich they looked almost supernatural under the gaslight. But here's the catch. Those colors were cooked up with arsenic, mercury, and chromium. Every suit was basically a wearable chemistry experiment, and the poor tailor was the lab rat breathing it all in. Take Paris green, for example. It looked stunning. A shade so bright it practically glowed, the kind of color that made you feel important just wearing it. But it came with a nasty price tag. This dye didn't just stain fabric, it stained people. Rashes, ulcers, and, if you were unlucky enough to keep it on long enough, a solid dose of organ failure. Customers sometimes collapsed in their finery after a ball, poisoned by the very trousers that made them look sharp. But the real victims were the tailors, who handled that cloth every day, cutting, stitching, and breathing in clouds of arsenic dust until their lungs sounded like sandpaper. And it wasn't just the greens. Blacks were steeped in chromium, blues in mercury salts. Tailors coughed, sneezed, and itched their way through the workday, the chemicals seeping through their skin like an unwanted handshake from death itself. Imagine sewing velvet in a room with no ventilation, the fibers floating around like snowflakes that melt straight into your lungs. Victorian tailors didn't need cigarettes. Their job was the cigarette. The irony was brutal. A wealthy gentleman might only wear his poison suit once a week, showing it off at church or a party, while the tailor who made it lived in that poison every single day. Fashion was the client's accessory, but for the tailor, it was a slow and steady executioner. Now take another sip, because the dyes were only half the misery. The other half was what those chemicals did to the tailor's body over time, and the diseases that stitched themselves into every bone, muscle, and lung. The longer a tailor lasted in the shop, the more his body betrayed him. The job wasn't just exhausting, it carved illness into every inch of him. One of the nastiest was Tailor's lung, a slow-motion suffocation caused by breathing in fibers day after day. Every cut, every stitch sent tiny flecks of wool and cotton drifting through the air, lodging themselves deep in the lungs. After a few years, tailors didn't just cough, they hacked like broken accordions, wheezing as though every breath was a negotiation. And that was only the start. The work bent bodies like paper clips. Spend 14 hours hunched over a bench, eyes squinting at tiny stitches in candlelight, and eventually you stop straightening up altogether. Tailor's hunch, they called it. Spines curved like question marks, necks permanently dipped forward. Add in the relentless eye strain, and by the age of 30, a tailor looked 50 and peered at the world through a squint that never went away. The cramped workshops didn't just warp spines and blur vision, they spread disease like wildfire. Tuberculosis thrived in those airless rooms, carried in coughs that echoed off the walls and landed in the lungs of every apprentice within reach. You could almost imagine Death himself, perched on a stool in the corner, tapping his foot, patiently waiting his turn while the boys sewed. And then there was the cure nobody talked about but everybody used, alcohol. Tailors drank to numb the aches, to quiet the coughs, to make the hours blur into something bearable. A bottle of gin could smooth over the day, even if it left tomorrow worse than before. Sober Tailor in the 1850s? About as rare as trousers without holes in them. The workshop was a machine, and the product wasn't just suits, it was broken men. And yet somehow they kept going, kept stitching, kept living in the very rooms that were killing them. If you're still here, enjoying this dark little trip into the tailor's anatomy of suffering, and you haven't subscribed yet, I have to wonder, are you trying to give me Tailor's lung too? Go on, drop your excuse in the comments so we can all stitch it into the record. Because next, we're stepping outside the body and into the social world. How society saw tailors and why these bent, coughing men were both essential and endlessly mocked. Despite all the blood, burns, and bad lungs, tailors were never showered with respect. In fact, Victorian society treated them like the wallpaper of fashion, always there, holding things together but rarely acknowledged. A gentleman couldn't show his face at church or the club without a decent coat, yet the man who made it was considered little more than a servant of vanity. Essential, but invisible. They weren't seen as artists shaping elegance, but as hired hands chasing hems. A poet might write about a painter or a sculptor, but you won't find many sonnets praising the man who stitched trousers. Instead, tailors were mocked, the butt of endless jokes in the press. You've probably heard the saying, 9 tailors make a man. That little jab came from the idea that a tailor was so insignificant, you needed 9 of them stitched together just to equal one real person. Imagine breaking your back sewing suits for the upper class, only to have them laugh that you barely count as human. Victorian humor at its finest, cruel, smug, and printed in cheap ink. But tailors weren't just passive victims of fashion's hierarchy. They organized. They struck. In smoky taverns and back rooms, they built solidarity, whispering about wages and working hours until whispers became chants and chants became full-blown strikes. Early unions rose out of these workshops, tailors standing together against employers who thought of them as endlessly replaceable. For a moment, the bent-backed, coughing tailor could straighten up, even if it was only to march down the street demanding something better. And that's what gets me. These men risked what little security they had, knowing they could be blacklisted or starved out, all for the chance of a fairer wage. They had the guts to strike for better pay, in an era where that kind of defiance could ruin you. Meanwhile, you can't even strike the red button below? Go on, leave your weak excuse in the comments. We'll measure it for a laugh, maybe stitch it into a little jacket of shame. Because while tailors were mocked on the outside, the real grind was happening even deeper inside the trade. In the needle-studded world of women and seamstresses, where the dangers were just as sharp, but the pay was somehow even sharper, cutting down to nothing. Now, if the tailor's lot was grim, the seamstresses was downright tragic. Women in the trade lived on the edge of survival, stitching their way through endless piles of piecework for pennies. Every shirt collar, every hem, every buttonhole was paid by the piece, not the hour. And the math never worked out. You could work yourself blind for 12 hours and still walk away with barely enough to buy bread. For some, the choice was cruelly simple. Sew until your fingers bled, or sell your body when the needle could no longer keep you alive. More than one seamstress found herself moving from the workbench to the streets because society valued both her labor and her body at a discount. Picture the scene. A cramped room lit by a single candle stub, wax dripping into saucers, and a woman leaning so close to the flame, she risked setting her hair alight just to see the stitches. Her eyes strain, her back aches, and the piles of unfinished shirts loom like a wall threatening to crush her. Sometimes they literally did. Papers from the period record seamstresses collapsing from exhaustion, dying with needles still threaded in their hands. Thomas Hood captured it in his famous poem, The Song of the Shirt. It wasn't just a piece of literature, it was practically reportage in rhyme. He wrote of a woman stitch, 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 through hunger, through cold, through despair. Romanticized in print, ignored in reality. That was the Victorian classic. Society cried over poems about starving seamstresses, then turned around and paid them less than the price of a loaf. And the fires. Oh, the fires. Candle flames toppled onto cloth heaps, and in minutes, whole rooms went up like kindling. More than one seamstress perished not from hunger, but from the very flame she needed to see her work. Imagine working so long by candlelight that the light itself became your executioner. Romanticized in poems, ignored at payday. That was the life of the Victorian seamstress, a woman who clothed the empire, yet could barely clothe herself. And here's where I nudge you again. These women sewed until their fingers bled, sometimes dying in rented rooms with a needle still in hand. And you're still sitting there without subscribing? At least tell me in the comments why you're treating this channel with the same neglect the Victorians gave their seamstresses. We'll all share a toast to your terrible excuse. Because while the women suffered in silence, the machine of fashion roared on, fed by demand, fueled by money, and grinding down everyone in its path. Next, let's talk about the economics of fashion itself. Victorian fashion wasn't just about elegance. It was about volume. Suits, uniforms, dresses, morning clothes, Sunday bests. The demand was endless. Britain's growing middle class wanted to look the part, and every rising clerk, every shopkeeper's wife, every officer in uniform needed clothes that showed they'd made it. Tailors and seamstresses weren't just dressing the rich anymore, they were feeding the hunger of a whole social class desperate for respectability. And that hunger chewed through workers like cloth under shears. Enter the sweating system. It sounds like a workout plan, but really it was a nightmare business model. Instead of big shops with decent space, garment production was pushed into crowded tenements. Picture entire families hunched over benches in one stifling room, sewing for hours under the watchful eye of a contractor. Kids threading needles, mothers bent over dresses, fathers cutting fabric on the floorboards, air thick with dust and sweat, hence the name. These weren't workshops, they were sweat boxes. And the only thing mass-produced was misery. Immigrant labor was the backbone. Jewish and Irish families fleeing poverty or persecution landed in London only to be folded straight into the sweating system. They were cheap, desperate, and willing to work longer hours for less, because the alternative was hunger. The city's elite wagged their tongues about foreigners undercutting wages, but happily bought the coats stitched in those same rooms. Hypocrisy was as fashionable as top hats. And why all this madness? Consumer culture. The middle class wanted fashion fast and cheap, the same way we want fast fashion now. A clerk couldn't afford a Savile Row suit, but he could afford one cut in a sweating shop tenement. Every bargain came at the cost of someone else's lungs, fingers, and future. If you've ever wondered why sweatshop still rings true today, here's the blueprint. Victorians invented the system we still haven't escaped. Now, if you're nodding along thinking, wow, history really does repeat itself, please subscribe, because the economics made fashion profitable, but they also made tailor shops into tinderboxes, not just metaphorically. Fires, collapses, and epidemics turned the workplace into a literal death trap. And that's where we're headed next. If you thought the tailor shop was just miserable, think again. It could also kill you outright. Fires were the most obvious hazard. Picture a room stacked floor to ceiling with fabric, lit only by gas lamps and candles, with coal-heated irons glowing red on every bench. One slip, one toppled flame, and the whole place went up like a bonfire in seconds. Tailors sometimes didn't even have time to run. Their legacy was reduced to ashes and the faint smell of scorched wool. And if the flames didn't get you, the buildings themselves might. Many workshops were tucked inside rickety tenements, overcrowded and crumbling from the inside out. Floors buckled under the weight of workers and cloth, Staircases collapsed, roofs leaked, and sometimes fell. These were not places designed for human safety. They were warehouses stuffed with bodies, each one bent over a task, hoping the ceiling didn't come down before payday. Then there were the invisible killers, the epidemics. Cramped quarters and stale air made tailor shops a perfect breeding ground for disease. One cough could take down half a workshop in a week. Tuberculosis, influenza, even outbreaks of typhus crept through those rooms like uninvited guests. The tragic part? Many kept working anyway, coughing over cloth, sneezing into seams, because to stop meant starvation. You didn't call in sick in the Victorian era. You stitched sick, you coughed sick, you died sick. It's no wonder most tailors didn't see old age. Many worked themselves into the ground before 40, their bodies used up, their lungs shredded, their eyes ruined. They clothed an empire, but rarely had enough left over to keep themselves alive. Every polished suit in Victorian London was, in a way, stitched with stolen years. Now take another drink, because the story doesn't end in those sweat-soaked rooms. Out of the ashes and coughing fits came anger. Tailors fighting back, demanding better, and slowly stitching the first seams of reform. For decades, tailors and seamstresses coughed and stitched in silence, but even the quietest needle can prick deep enough to draw attention. By the late 19th century, resistance began to stir. Trade unions grew from the smoky corners of pubs and meeting halls, where tailors gathered after endless shifts to complain, plot, and eventually organize. Out of those whispered conversations came strikes. Real, coordinated walkouts, where tailors dropped their needles and demanded better. Imagine the sight. Whole workshops of bent-backed men straightening up, marching in the streets, reminding the city that even elegance had a price. Public awareness began to shift too. Journalists exposed the horrors of sweated labor, painting vivid pictures of families hunched in damp rooms, sewing for starvation wages. Suddenly, the genteel world of fashion had a rotten smell to it. Even Parliament couldn't ignore it forever. Inspectors were dispatched, investigations made, and though progress was painfully slow, the pressure eventually stitched its way into law. Factory acts that once applied only to mills and mines crept into tailoring, demanding inspections, limiting hours, and nudging the trade towards safer conditions. But reform wasn't just about law. It was about economics, too. The rise of department stores and ready-made clothing changed everything. Instead of bespoke suits for every gentleman, racks of pre-cut garments rolled off new factory lines. Tailors who once prided themselves on individual craft found themselves competing with mass production. It was progress, but progress with sharp edges. Fewer deaths in cramped sweatshops, but also fewer jobs for the small craftsmen who couldn't keep up with the pace of the machine. Resistance, reform, and change. It wasn't a clean victory. It was messy, slow, and stitched together like a patchwork coat. But it meant that the tailor of 1900 stood a slightly better chance of living past 40 than his grandfather ever did. Because reform may have saved some lives, but the story doesn't end there. Tailors left behind more than clothes. They left a legacy, a reminder that even the finest suits are stitched with human cost. And that legacy still lingers, whether we admit it or not. The tailor's story doesn't end in the gaslit workshops of Victorian London. In many ways, it's still with us, stitched invisibly into every piece of clothing you own. Tailors were the backbone of fashion, the quiet hands that made elegance possible. Every waistcoat, every crisp uniform, every sweeping gown owed its life to men and women hunched over cloth until their eyes blurred. Yet their names were never remembered. The credit went to the gentlemen wearing the suits, not the people bleeding into them. That's the great irony, isn't it? Elegance was bought with blood, sweat, and arsenic. The very fabrics that dazzled under chandeliers were killing the people who stitched them together. The finest green waistcoat at the opera might have been woven from the coughs of a dozen tailors and the blindness of a seamstress. Fashion has always had a shadow side, and in Victorian times, that shadow was long, dark, and coughing itself to death. And here's the uncomfortable truth: that legacy never really went away. The Victorian sweating system was the prototype for the modern sweatshop. Overcrowded rooms, underpaid workers, dangerous machinery, poisons, fires. We've simply shifted the geography. What happened in the slums of London 150 years ago now happens in Dhaka, Guangzhou, or Phnom Penh. The thread of exploitation has never been cut. Victorian tailors were just the blueprint. So, you've spent nearly an hour with me in this shop, watching thread and blood weave together, following the coughs, the burns, the bent spines, and the poison dyes. And if you're still sitting there without subscribing, that's like ordering a suit, strutting out the door in it, and refusing to pay the tailor who made it. History leaves us with this. Every stitch has a story, and not all of them are elegant. Some are soaked in misery, some in defiance, and some, like tonight's tale, in both. So raise your glass, dim the lights, and remember that behind every polished gentleman, there was always a coughing tailor in the shadows. Now, before we pack up the needles and shears, it's time for the and more part of this video, because the Victorians had no shortage of deadly jobs, and tailors weren't the only ones coughing their way into the grave. Let's climb, quite literally, into another nightmare, the life of the chimney sweep. Imagine being a child, barely old enough to tie your own shoes, and your job is to crawl into a narrow chimney coated with decades of soot. You wriggle upward in the dark, then scraping your elbows raw, your lungs filling with black dust. No ladders, no brushes, no safety ropes. Just your tiny body shoved into a shaft, expected to wriggle and scrape until the flue was clean enough for a rich family's tea kettle to boil without smoke. Childhood, Victorian style. And here's where it turns from miserable to grotesque. The soot didn't just make them cough, it gave them one of the first recorded occupational cancers. Doctors even gave it a name, chimney sweep's carcinoma. Sounds clinical, but what it meant in practice was malignant tumors forming on the scrotums of young boys, thanks to constant contact with soot while they crawled naked or half naked through chimneys. Yes, you heard that right. Crawling through cancer-causing filth with bare skin because clothes made it harder to squeeze through. You can almost hear the Health and Safety Committee of the time shrugging. And the deaths weren't always slow. Sweeps sometimes got stuck in chimneys, wedged in narrow passages until they suffocated. Others fell from rooftops, or burned alive when fires were lit before they'd finished the job. Imagine being so invisible to society that someone might literally forget you were in the flue and just light the fire anyway. That's not just neglect, that's a horror story with soot on it. The Victorians loved their fireplaces, but every warm hearth was bought with a child's misery. Behind every cozy winter evening sat a boy with raw knees, ruined lungs, and no future past 30. That's the price of comfort when comfort is measured in coal dust. Now refill that glass, because we're heading next into another fire hazard of Victorian labor, the match girls, whose smiles sometimes literally glowed until their jaws rotted away. If chimney sweeps gave us soot and suffocation, the match girls gave us something even more grotesque. Glowing smiles that led straight to the grave. These were the young women and girls who worked in match factories, dipping little sticks of wood into white phosphorus, a substance so toxic it practically whispered death into their bones. At first it seemed harmless enough. Fingers yellowed, clothes stank of chemicals, but the matches lit and the world moved on. Then the pain began. Teeth aching, gums swelling, faces tender. The phosphorus didn't just irritate, it burrowed in, eating the jawbone from the inside out. They called it Fossy Jaw. Doesn't that sound quaint? In reality, it was a slow-motion horror show. Abscesses bursting, bone turning black, the stench of rotting flesh clinging to the poor girl long before she died. Imagine lighting a candle with the same substance that's dissolving your face. And yet, these girls kept working. Why? Because the alternative was starvation. Piecework wages meant long hours, filthy conditions, and no protection. Employers brushed it off, claiming the girls must have had bad teeth to begin with. Victim blaming, Victorian edition. But here's where the story takes a turn. In 1888, the match girls decided enough was enough. They walked out. Hundreds of them went on strike, demanding better pay, safer conditions, and the removal of white phosphorus from their factories. And against all odds, they won. Their strike became legendary, a moment when exploited workers, young women at that, stood up to industrial giants and actually forced change. Out of their suffering came one of the earliest victories for labor rights. So next time you strike a match, remember that the price of that tiny flame was once a woman's jawbone. Progress has its martyrs, and these girls glowed in the dark for all the wrong reasons. Pour another drink, because we're not done. Death had many trades in the Victorian era, and one of the grimmest was the undertaker, the man who turned misery into a profession. If the match girls glowed and the chimney sweeps choked, the undertaker lived in the middle of both troubles, up to his elbows in the city's private tragedies, carrying other people's grief like a second skin. Being an undertaker in Victorian London meant you were part funeral director, part carpenter, part night watchman, and part emergency responder to whatever horror the day had left behind. You dressed the dead, laid them out with surprising ceremony, built the coffins that would hold them, and then carted them off through lane and fog while curious neighbors peered from windows. It was a business built on finery and necessity, and the men who ran it were both indispensable and odd to polite society. The work began with the body. Before refrigeration and before modern mortuary science, corpses were a hazard you handled directly. Undertakers opened sealed windows, propped the chin, washed the cold skin, and dressed the corpse in linen and lace, sometimes better clothes than the person had any right to wear in life. They stooped over the cadaver for hours, stitching, arranging, perfuming, trying to present something peaceful to those who had to say goodbye. That intimacy with the dead left undertakers with senses that the rest of us don't develop. A knack for spotting the first slackening of a jaw, the way a hand will cool, the rhythm of a family's quiet grief. It was intimate labor, and it left marks. There were practical dangers, too. Disease didn't knock politely. Cholera, typhus, smallpox. When an epidemic hit, undertakers worked day and night. They hauled victims out of crowded rooms, wrapped them in whatever cloth was available, and carried them through streets already reeking of fear. Protective equipment was minimal, a cloth over the face, perhaps, if they were lucky, so they often caught the same illnesses they handled. Their lungs and nerves paid the price. And if a builder's ladder didn't collapse or a candle didn't tip, the undertaker might still lose sleep for nights over the bodies that passed through his hands. Then, there were the darker corners of the trade. Early in the century, when medical schools needed bodies for dissection, body snatchers, the resurrection men, prowled graveyards by night. Some undertakers turned a blind eye, some quietly facilitated the trade by supplying cadavers or selling old coffins. It was a grim side hustle that filled the anatomy rooms and filled pockets. After public outrage and scandal, the law changed. The Anatomy Act eased the supply issues for medics and cut into the resurrectionists' market. But for decades, the shadow of grave robbing hung over funeral houses like a stubborn fog. There was also the business angle. Funeral directors charged for everything: the coffin, the pallbearers, the carriage, the wreaths, the viewing room. For many families, a proper burial was a final luxury to be scraped and borrowed for. Undertakers, who often made their own coffins as cabinet makers, were accused of being comfortable profiteers, and sometimes they were. But even the shrewdest director had to contend with the human cost: late-night calls, bodies that decomposed faster than expected, and families who couldn't pay. They balanced compassion and commerce in the only way they could, by keeping a ledger and learning how to keep their hands steady while grieving filled the room. And the hours. Those graveyard shifts were literal. Undertakers did their best work when the rest of the world slept, preparing for wakes at dawn, carrying corpses before the streets were crowded, digging graves in the half-light. They ended up seeing more faces at 2 a.m. than their neighbors saw in a year. Imagine your social life reduced to coffins and condolence cards. It makes a bad Tinder bio. Top up your glass, because the night isn't done. Next up, we'll unpick mill workers and navvies, men whose machines and explosives made them into walking hazards, and whose stories knit together economics, empire, and danger in ways that'll make your teeth chatter. The mill is a different kind of terror, a cathedral of cotton where the hymn is the clack and whir of 1,000 looms. Walk into one and you hear 100 shuttles beating time, belts hissing like snakes, and the air itself full of a snow of fiber. It looks almost industrious from a distance. Rows of machines, men and women at their posts, a sense of production. Up close, it's a factory floor of small cruelties, the kind that add up until your lungs remember them forever. Machines loved speed. Owners wanted output, not comfort, so looms ran fast and safety lagged behind. Fingers found themselves where they shouldn't, under a flying shuttle, caught in a gear, nipped off by a bobbin. One slip and the machine did not care about your rent or your children. Amputations were common enough to be a grim part of the workday. Prosthetics were few and dignity fewer. Imagine stitching for a living and then losing the hand that earns you bread. The workplace suddenly becomes a very personal form of violence. Then there was the cotton dust, an invisible enemy that gathered in lungs like fog. Men and women coughed until their chests felt empty. Breath became a negotiation. Doctors would later call it bisonosis, brown lung, a disease that made the workday itself an instrument of slow suffocation. People joked about the mill cough at first, then stopped joking when the coughing didn't end. Mills made clothes for the world, but they also made sickness for the workers who fed them into the machines. Child labor threaded through these rooms like a second spool. Small hands were prized because they could reach into tight places, fix a tangled thread, or oil a stubborn part. Parents sent kids to the mill because hunger is a better employer than charity. Often children were first sent to mind the bobbins, then pushed to tending machines, and then to the worst tasks as their bodies were asked to grow up in a single day. You can't romanticize that. It's the reason reformers pushed so hard for laws to raise the minimum age and limit hours. Accidents and epidemics like to travel together. One broken guard on a machine and a cough from a crowded dormitory could create a week of grief in a village. Fires started in oily corners. Whole mills burned while workers scrambled through narrow exits. The mills were engines of empire and extraction. Raw cotton pulled from colonies, spun in northern towns, and turned into profit that rarely wore the faces of the people who made it. And yet, just like tailors, mill workers organized. They learned the rhythms of solidarity, strike lines, pamphlets, and the slow education that collective action could change a ledger. Those early unions won shorter hours, sometimes better ventilation, and a sense that industry didn't have to mean annihilation. Progress arrived imperfectly and late, but it arrived because people refused to be treated as replaceable cogs. Finish your drink. We're heading out from the mill floor next to the navvies, those men who dug Britain into being. Explosives, collapsing cuttings, and a nickname that meant widowmaker. They called them navvies, short for navigators, because the first of them dug canals, but by the 19th century, they were the men who carved railways out of the countryside. Picture a line of bodies like a seam through the earth, pickaxes raised, shovels biting into clay, boots knee-deep in mud that never quite lets go. The great Victorian landscape was stitched together by hands that smelled of smoke, sweat, and wet stone. If you could hear the work from a distance, it was a kind of thunder. The steady rhythm of men moving earth, the single sharp crack when a charge went off, and then the awful silence as dust settled and someone checked if the world still had room for the next man. Blasting was part of the job. Early on, it was gunpowder. Later, it was nitroglycerin and dynamite, miracles that made quick work of rock and then promptly made quick work of careless hands. You'd pack a hole with powder, light a fuse, and step back while the valley rearranged itself. Sometimes the valley rearranged the men instead, flying shale, malicious boulders, a concussion that left ears ringing for days. Tunnels were worse. You worked shoulder to shoulder in a throat of stone with candles for light, and the roof above you had an opinion about whether it wanted to stay up. A single misjudged blast, and the tunnel could cough you out in pieces. Men died buried alive, and their mates shoveled all night with bare hands to pull them free, rescue that was as likely to save them as it was to give a living man a new kind of nightmare. Weather was an enemy with mood swings. Rain turned a cutting into a river. Mud became a trap that pulled a man down faster than a foreman's shout could pull him out. Cold seeped into bones. Wet clothes were a slow murderer. And then there was the constant small cruelty of the job. Cramped, cold huts to sleep in, irregular pay, piecework promises, and the knowledge that a single slip could mean a widow and fatherless children in a single hour. Widowmaker isn't a romantic Victorianism. It was a blunt market term for a job that paid by the mile and collected men by the week. Illness moved through the camps like a rumor. Frostbite, trench foot, infections from small injuries, and the toll of long marches back to the nearest town to beg for a doctor who might not come. Alcohol steadied more than hands. It steadied nerves enough to swing a pick on a morning when everything in you wanted to stay in bed. Like every dangerous trade, the navvies learned gallows humor. Songs about cliffs that tried to swallow them. Jokes about the boss who'd rather have the contract finished than a man alive. Humor is how communities survive the unbearable. And yet, they built wonders. Viaducts that seemed to defy gravity, tunnels that cut through hills, lines that shrank the world. All of them the product of that terrible, patient labor. There's an odd, ugly nobility in it. A man covered in clay could be both anonymous in the ledger and immortal in stone. A bridge with no plaque still remembers the hands that broke themselves to set its stones. If you've already subscribed, cheers to you. You're part of this dimly lit workshop we've built together. A little circle where the coughs of tailors, the soot of chimney boys, and the glow of match girls still find a voice. But if you've sat here with me for nearly an hour, listening to needles prick, irons hiss, and railways blast apart mountains, and you still won't subscribe, then you're the gentleman who struts out in a fine new suit, pockets full, and refuses to pay the tailor who stitched it. At least leave your excuse in the comments. I'll be here with my tape measure, a pint, and more than a little judgment. The gaslights are guttering low, the last train rattles into the fog, and the city exhales into silence. Until next time, keep your glass topped up and your curiosity sharper than a tailor's shears.